I guess we might as well get underway. My name is Terry Gannon. I'm founder and CEO of a company called Intelog Inc. We build applications based on open source software and open source data, primarily for the oil and gas industry, but other industries as well. It's my profound pleasure to be the moderator of the session this afternoon, where we're going to talk about open data as it relates to municipalities. Municipalities have been providing data to citizens and encouraging open data initiatives. In fact, my experience has been that they have actually been leading all levels of government in terms of making data available. So I think that they're an example that we could well follow in other areas of government. This is changing very fundamentally the way communities are interacting with their citizens, and also sparking new and creative uses for data being used. I mean, put good data in the hands of creative people, you get some interesting results. Not the results that you necessarily expect, but interesting nonetheless. This panel will actually be talking about the culture shift around open and shared data that has caused this change and what this means for our future interactions with and uses of data, particularly in the municipal environment. And it's, again, my pleasure to introduce the members of the panel this afternoon from left to right. On the left is, my far left, is Mr. Bruce MacArthur, President and CEO of Tesera Systems. The panelists will be giving a short introduction themselves in a few minutes, so I'll leave that part of it to them. To his right is Mr. Chris Moore, who is the CIO of the City of Edmonton. To his right is Matthew Dance, graduate student, University of Alberta, and team member of WiserPath. And I'm interested to know what WiserPath is all about. And Tracey Lauriault, co-founder of CivicAccess and co-author of datalibra.ca. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that last one. And again, the panelists will have an opportunity. In fact, we'll start now. In fact, can we move right over to the left again, Bruce? And if you could introduce yourself in a few minutes' time, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, Bruce MacArthur with Tesera Systems, President and CEO. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about our experience in this area with open data. Our firm is an IT firm. We've focused primarily on the user and the use of data in trying to provide more timely and more effective solutions. One of the challenges, as we all know, is getting the right data to the right people at the right time, and their ability to find the data that they need, and then of course to have the frameworks and the ability to be able to interpret that data and analyze it and provide the decision makers with quality decisions so that they can make recommendations and move forward. So a big focus of our firm has been in the natural resource area, and starting in forestry and then oil and gas, water, with the Water and Environment Hub here in Alberta, and also in other sectors such as the insurance sector, working in Alberta and across Canada and internationally. Chris.
Great, thanks, Bruce. Chris Moore, CIO at the City of Edmonton. As we said earlier, I've been there for 3 years, and it's a fantastic place to be. The city is a very innovative city. We've been doing IT for the last 60 years, if you can believe it or not. Our first system was in 1951. It was actually related to water billing. And we've had a lot of great innovations over those 60 years with spatial data, the internet. And it's not just about innovation within IT. The City of Edmonton itself is an innovator in a number of areas: waste management, recycling, fleet management. We've just recently taken our parts of our drainage organization with all our big tunneling equipment and put it into a utility, so we can now bid on tunneling projects wherever we can take our tunneling gear on the train. And that's really neat, because in this day and age when people are talking about revenue and tax base, if you know anything about our city, or if you live in the city, you benefit from the fact that about half of our cash comes from investment income. And I don't mean money that's invested necessarily in the markets, but because of the money that we get from the TELUS Fund, because of the money that we get from EPCOR. And so we're a very creative city in terms of managing funds and financing. I'm not in a position to answer any questions about the arena. I can read you the statement that we have currently. And so we've been having a lot of fun over the last few years with not just open data, but open gov. What does that mean? We've been in the cloud since about 2005, and so yes, you know, let's talk about security, privacy, and the Patriot Act, my favorite 3 things. If you want to know about our Canadian Anti-Terrorism Act, that's pretty strong too. And so it's an exciting time to be in technology and especially in government. As I like to tell people, right now government is not for the faint of heart.
And next we have Matthew Dance.
My name is Matthew Dance, clearly. I am not Nick Garkusha. Nick sends his regrets. I'm a master's student at the University of Alberta. I'm a geographer, or a new geographer. I'm interested in how people understand and communicate location using the GeoWeb and the tools associated with the GeoWeb. That's kind of led me to 3 projects that are only tangentially related to my master's and drawing out the process, making me a graduate student, not a grad student. WiserPath is a project that is looking to leverage citizen input in a public participation platform based in the GeoWeb on how the City of Edmonton is doing in developing the infrastructure, River Valley Trails, LRT systems, that type of thing. I'm also a research associate with Edmonton Pipelines, and that's a small group of researchers in Edmonton who are looking to bring together the urban theory, digital mapping, and digital technology in a way that sheds some light on what it is to be an Edmontonian, what it is to live in Edmonton, to work and breathe, to commute, that type of thing. And I was also involved with a project called Emitter.ca, which took a semi-open data set, the National Pollution Release Inventory from Natural Resources Canada and Environment Canada, and liberated it in a way that it made the data set searchable on a big map and mashed it with MP information so that you could search for the large industrial emitters in your neighborhood and then contact directly through the application the MP who was responsible for those emissions. We also took that data and transformed it so that it would be hosted by data.gc.ca, kind of the precursor to the federal government open data portal. The goal was to essentially create open data for the federal government that was based on a citizen initiative. That's kind of the work that I'm involved with right now. Tracey?
Hi, Tracey Lauriault. Nice to be here in this beautiful, beautiful town. I'm with a group called CivicAccces.ca. I'm one of the co-founders, and Civic Access is essentially an online list that was founded in 2005. It's the Canadian list that talks about open data. Everyone from librarians to archivists to the nerdiest of the nerds, app developers, data people, scientists, etc., are involved in ongoing discussions about licensing, about data, about access, about legal issues, etc., etc. Also, co-author of a blog called datalibera.ca. Anybody who followed the census issue, debacle, censuslessness, whichever way you want to call it, you would have come across this blog because this was the blog that was informing most of the journalists in the country so that they could have some base data to be able to inform the work that they were doing. I've been involved in issues related to open data and open access for a very long time, but primarily from the perspective of community-based development and community-based research. So it's the idea that local community environmental groups, social policy groups, women's groups, social planning councils, etc., can have access to public data so that they can deliberate on par with public officials on a variety of issues, or to advocate on these issues on behalf of the people that they represent on par with public services. I work at different levels of government, municipal level, provincial level, and the federal level. And some of the work that I've been actively involved in lately has been the Community Data Consortium, where about 56 different jurisdictions in Canada, about 1,000 community groups, municipalities, community health and resource centers together, unfortunately, have to group purchase census data when we used to have census data. They group purchase census data and develop capacity on how to use that data and how to use that data to be able to deliberate a variety of public policy issues. Also, I have been working with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities on their quality of life indicator system, and if anybody's ever tried to put together an indicator system of over 100 indicators and having to deal with 3 levels of government and all their multiple departments across 24 cities across the country, you'll understand why I work on issues related to open data, because it's really quite a nightmare. So I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you on this particular issue. And some of the other areas I'm involved in on a scientific level is the archiving and preservation of scientific data, whereas we look at scientific data as actually being a Canadian heritage document or artifact, and that we need to consider data as an artifact so that we can preserve it for future research, because science is actually part of our knowledge-based economy, and it's also part of our culture in Canada. So I'd love to have a conversation about that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, folks. And obviously, I don't need to add the comment that we obviously have a superbly well-qualified panel today, and I'm excited to hear what they have to say, and excited to hear what your questions are going to be. This is actually the part of the presentation that's probably going to be the most fun, because we're actually going to encourage you to participate and ask questions of these very well-qualified panel members. So right out of the box, if anybody has a specific question they just want to ask right now, by all means raise your hand, and Amanda will come up there with the mic, and you'll be a star for 10 seconds. And if there are no questions, oh, somebody has a question right off the bat. Beautiful.
I've probably got questions for all of you, but I'll just start out with Tracey's remarks about the heritage aspect of data. There's some discussion about trying to establish trusted data repositories throughout the country, whether that be specific domains like water or environment, or whether it's general stuff, whether things should be made to be accessible, completely open, or whether there's tags allowing different levels of access and so on. Do you want to speak to me a moment about where you see those trusted data repositories going, whether or not you see that movement taking roots and actually producing something that we can all use?
It's all about the money, because right now there are fabulous discussions. Research Data Canada at the National Research Council of Canada has just had a summit and has had that discussion in Ottawa just 2 weeks ago. And the discussion that they've been having on the preservation of these data and making these data accessible is actually an old conversation that goes back to 1998, 1999. The problem has been in Canada that there hasn't been any money put towards the actual construction of trusted digital repositories. The Canadian Association of Research Libraries has been very active in universities to try and set up these trusted digital repositories. I think that there's great potential in them, providing that it's not just for students, faculty, and researchers. The Data Liberation Initiative, for instance, which was a way for Canadian students and faculty to work with Statistics Canada data that is a cost recovery type of data set, was set up to be open to the entire public, but got closed down through the licensing system to only faculty and students. So what I would hope with the trusted digital repositories with scientific data, because most Canadian data from the sciences is publicly funded type of research. And if it's publicly funded type of research, I think that there is a public interest in having those data available for future research and for researchers to be able to collaborate between and amongst each other and share those data. So I think the potential is there. I just haven't seen anybody put any money on the table to actually build these things.
I'd encourage the other panel members to add their own comments if they would so choose.
Well, I don't think I can add anything to what Tracey said, but I find the whole idea of information as an artifact something that we really need to look at. I just spent the last 3 days at the International Information Commissioners Conference, and around the world, there's all kinds of different levels of practice as it relates to access to information. And some of the things that I think we need to address nationally and be in a position to deal with it internationally are things like data sovereignty, the free flow of information, which I really think is connected to cloud computing, but I see Australia and New Zealand and the EU putting up kind of walls around their nations, and I don't think that's sustainable. And so the whole, we need to get to a different place. I have this simple vision. If data could travel with a Nexus card and maintain its country of origin, then I think we would all be in a better place. but there just so many countries don't have the infrastructure and don't have, you know, things there. So I believe Canada is leading in this front on a local government level, whereas other nations are leading more nationally. And I tweet on a regular basis looking for that MP out there who's going to be the sponsor. And Tracey's heard me say this before, but our success locally, I think, would apply to any level of government. You need political leadership, administrative, you know, sponsorship, and then community engagement. And we're big on that side. So I hear what you're saying, Rob, and it's just there's been so much work done on access to information over the last 30 plus years. There's so much more to do. And the technology is moving quicker than the policy, and if we don't figure that out soon, we're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, thanks. I agree with everything that's been stated. I'll add another dimension, and that relates to the, I guess, the need for standards. In the research community right now, there's really no unified standard for requirement of storage of data. We have a huge demographic shift happening. There's data being stored at home at researchers on their hard drives in various locales across the country in various ways, states and forms, tapes, and all different types of storage facilities. For a user to be able to benefit from that data and not have to replicate and waste finite resources when that data is perfectly useful, if it was available and if it was understood, would be huge for the research community, and it's not right now. So I think we need some leadership in this area, and I think the Trusted Data Repository Initiative has potential, and it's something that I think we should all be looking at as a means to be able to address that problem.
Tracey,
and opportunity.
A brief follow-up as well.
One of the things that Michael was talking about this morning was this national strategy. And part of that national strategy and part of the main submissions that had come into that national digital strategy was on the preservation and archiving of digital information as well as digital data. So in a sense, you know, a good infrastructure, a good trusted digital repository infrastructure, a Library and Archives Canada infrastructure, a university infrastructure connected with provinces, territories, municipalities to actually do this on multiple levels, I think would be a really interesting way to go. The cyber infrastructure project in the US that came from the National Science Foundation was very interesting that way because they actually brought the smartest people they had in the shop, locked them up for 10 days and said, thou shalt come up with a cyber infrastructure strategy for the nation, and published that report and walked it around and talked about it. And I see no reason why we couldn't do that in Canada because we have some incredibly brilliant people, but we never tap into the brilliance. We hire consulting firms to advise the government on this. Nothing against consultants, I do that myself, but I think that there's a time where as you know, the citizens of the country as well as public officials, et cetera, need to come together in industry and hash it out and come up with a really good strategy and a really good project.
Just a question for you. When you say cyber infrastructure, do you mean like broadband to everybody?
The cyber infrastructure conversation in the U.S. wasn't just broadband. It was about data. It was about preservation. Yeah. It was a strategy like the one that Michael Geist was talking about.
Right, okay, yeah. Thank you. Oh, and if people see me using my computer, I'm not checking my bank account or my stocks. There's a lot of valuable information that's here, like the emitter stuff and some things that Tracey's saying and Bruce. I'm retweeting that with the conference hashtag.
It's actually Angry Birds.
Yeah. I dropped my iPad, so I stopped playing Angry Birds. And I just need to tell Matt, Craig Tomer's going to be here from Australia, and he's interested in the emitter app. So, but you'll see that later on Twitter. If you're not on social media, I suggest you figure out how to get there.
That was an excellent exchange, folks. Thanks very much. And again, I'd encourage the audience members to offer their own questions. I have a few, but I would much rather hear what you folks have to say. He's coming. I guess there should be a little bit of incidental music in here.
I could do that, yeah.
So I have a question related to the smart cities. How does it work? Thank you. So I have a question regarding the Smart Cities Initiative and the data aspect of it. There is lots of data that cities can collect, and the question is, what is the thinking right now about the policies around collecting this data, establishing that there is some kind of cleanliness in the provenance and sharing it? I can imagine lots of services that would be nice to have based on the traffic cameras, and I can imagine lots of services that I would not necessarily support. So we need some political processes in thinking and getting people's informed opinion, or basically educating the public and getting informed opinion. What's going on around this thing?
Absolutely. So the Smarter Cities report, and which is public, and I'll tweet the link to it after I finish speaking, was something we did with IBM. They worked with 24 cities around the world. We're the only city in Canada that benefit from it. We have put in a proposal around traffic safety and data and analytics and open data. I guess some great recommendations there, and now we're in the process of moving those things forward. The challenge is we've been collecting data since 1905. Not only collecting data, of course it's all in different formats, but it isn't so much an issue of the data. The bigger issue is culture. And one of the challenges in any level of government, anywhere in the world, is that for whatever reason, people are afraid. Government officials are afraid. I think some politicians are afraid. And so we need to find a way to infuse courage into those people to step out and share things. I've known for a few years that we really need to have some big, massive data cleansing strategy. But you know, if that was like $10 million, it's going to lose against, you know, the new Walter Dale Bridge. So my strategy on data cleansing is, let's take as much of our data and get it in the open data catalog, because guess what? The business unit says, oh, before we put that data catalog up, we have to clean the data. And that's great, so let's clean that data. The other thing that we're dealing with all of the data is people are still looking for clarity around what should we release, what should we not. People in the community say, give us all your data and we'll tell you what we don't want. And of course everybody understands there's private information that we can't release. So we've got right now, I think it's about 80 or 90 data sets. It goes up and down based on activity. We've got another 119 coming, but there's probably many more. And if you really want to talk to the mastermind behind OpenGov at the City of Edmonton, it's Ashley Cassavan, who's sitting right there. She's the mastermind, but Ashley's working on a policy that council has asked for, because they believe we need to have clear guidelines for the administration on when data is released and how that gets embedded into the business processes. And so if you are changing a business process or implementing a new system, what does that mean for an automatic release of data? And so we do have a lot of data. We're trying to get it out. We're currently working with the Coalition of the Willing, and open data at the city is starting to become kind of a vogue thing. You know, when council talks about it, then people think it's okay. But for me, it's really about the more we share, the more we can demystify ourselves, because over the last 106 years, we've created this mystique that we have all this secret private information. And we're no different than anybody else. I will tweet the report. There's some great things in there. The whole thing about data analytics or big data that IBM referenced, they're strongly encouraging us, and we're planning on setting up a center of excellence around data analytics. You could call that business intelligence, but also embedding the discipline of analytics into as many jobs as possible. In the same way we've done that with project management over the years, we don't want to have one group of people that's like doing all the analytics. We want it to have a part of the discipline of city workers. So hopefully that answers your question. But
Matthew, you had a comment?
From my perspective, Eleni, as a open data user, like I'm from Edmonton, I use the data that Chris and Ashley publish on the website. The IBM report was important because it's validating a lot of what people have been saying within the conversation and making it official, because it's coming from IBM, to City Council. So one of the cultural things that I've seen within the city is that the silo of open data is starting to diffuse and make its way into all the different business units where there are unofficial data evangelists. And this is just kind of validating the work that they're doing and giving them permission to go out and, release those geospatial data sets that folks like me are waiting for so that we can work with them within our GIS. So it's important from a report standpoint, but it's also important from a cultural shift standpoint and validating the work that people are doing within the city.
Bruce, did you have a comment about that? Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I'll just add to what's been said. I think from a private sector perspective, one of the challenges that companies have, they have some pretty talented people, especially in our team. We have an interdisciplinary team that crosses a broad range of different types of disciplines. And one of the things we run into when clients come to us is actually trying to get access to the data so that we can help solve a problem for them. My estimate that I've done just in my mind, just back of the envelope for Alberta alone is annually it's probably in the hundreds of millions of dollars that small SMEs like ours are prevented from realizing because they can't get access to the data. Now, I think that's conservative because there's some really talented people that every company has, and they can use that data in ways and means that none of us have even comprehended. So just finding the data, being able to filter it, to search it, and be able to use it can open up and diversify the economy of Alberta and Canada. So we should be putting pressure on our political leaders to open up.
Tracey.
I think the other part is citizens need to become part of the conversation. So what we haven't really seen in a significant way is citizens really being numerate or data literate, if I may say that, in the sense that they're not advocating for their public officials to actually release data. It winds up being people like myself, apps developers, specialists, some industry associations, some researchers. But at the end of the day, if there's a community traffic study that's been done and there's a report by an engineer and there's some data associated with that, well, a community group should have access to that report and should be able to go and have some context about the report, context about the data, and be able to use that data so that they can go back and deliberate back and forth as well. In terms of the item you brought up on provenance, I think that's very, very important because that's something that still people are discussing and trying to understand. They do have some basic metadata wrapped around some of the open data that's being provided, but I think archiving, preservation, versioning, all of that kind of stuff is something that the cities are still trying to work out. The people who have worked that out and who have really been the forefathers, because there weren't too many mothers at the time working on this stuff, but we're the forefathers of open data. And Canada was Natural Resources Canada. GeoConnections came later, but really GeoGratis, GeoBase, and the Discovery Portal were really the first to start releasing these types of data. They developed an open architecture. They have an understanding of open source, and they use open source. And if you're going to bid on any projects, you have to adhere to standards, have to be interoperable, et cetera, et cetera. And provenance and metadata are a key component of that particular strategy. So I encourage any of you who haven't taken a look at the Natural Resources Canada GeoGratis, GeoBase, and the Discovery Portal to go and take a look at those initiatives and go read their technology implementation plan and their architecture, because we're talking something that was put together in 2003, 2004, and it's brilliant, and it has been implemented.
I think that goes back to Bruce's point about standards. There's actually a very active group out of Australia looking to create metadata around all of this globally. And there's probably a group in Europe and probably a group somewhere else. So like anything, it's going to have to develop for a while until people figure out how to work together. But here's a perfect example. I don't think anybody's done this yet, but we've got traffic count data from 2004 to 2009. If you wanted to find the best place to put a billboard or an ad for impressions, just check that out. And simple things like that. But to Tracey's point, years ago I realized that we never taught our children, including me, Boolean logic, or I was asleep in that class, right? And if you understand Boolean logic, there's a whole world available to you. And so this whole space of analytics, that's the new math, if you will. So. but it's exciting days.
Sure. A final comment from Tracey, then on to the next question.
On the question of schemas, no. There, in the open data cities have some embedded into their systems right now. It's very, very rudimentary. I'm hoping that the open data cities are going to talk with ODESI, O-D-E-S-I, because ODESI is a group of librarians who actually have an infrastructure that disseminates data. And I think a conversation with open data cities in Canada and librarians will take us to a whole other plane and actually help us develop a standard that's reasonable for open data cities. We can't go geoconnections because we're talking ISO 19115 and it's crazy. And I think what we have now is too simple, but I think that there's a nice in-between place. And I think, you know, once we get over the licensing discussion and we get over a few other discussions between and among the cities, I think that might be one of the next items to think about.
Okay, on to the next question. Yeah, Amanda, if there's a Mike over here has got a question. Incidental music. Ding, 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 ding.
Thank you very much. I think it's really encouraging that we're having these insightful discussions around open data and sharing of data, particularly around government data. But I wanted to kind of refocus the discussion a little bit and around another angle, and that is, I think there's a growing appreciation that to some degree government is beginning to move some of their historical responsibilities and programs away from government and onto citizens themselves. And I think government is asking more and more of volunteer groups and citizen groups to begin to kind of take a lead in action, particularly in terms of the environment. And so my question really is around, is there a role in open data for the work that's being done by citizen groups around collecting what I might call citizen science, or even around the concept of traditional knowledge, the First Nations people? And is there a role for these kinds of open data programs and initiatives in this? And quite often they get criticized, I think, because of issues around QA and QC of the data, right? That's not data that we should be spending time on because there are all kinds of problems and issues with the way that the citizen science is conducted or the way that traditional knowledge gets incorporated. So my question to the panel is there a role for these kinds of other data sources and programs going forward?
Matthew, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah. Emphatically, yes. In my view, the next wave of open data will be from citizens. As the Microsoft sensors, or there's a group called Senseris out of France, they have handheld watch-sized sensors that will do environmental monitoring. It costs about $500,000 to put an air quality monitoring station in an urban area. There's one in downtown Edmonton that's at the top of a 4-story building, 3 blocks off the main corridor of traffic. So it's telling you that there's great air quality on the top of a 4-story building. If you deploy these things that are smaller than your smartphone, that are location sensitive throughout the environment, either on someone's backpack or embedded into lampposts, you start getting a great deal of data. The QA/QC problem is solved just by the volume of data that you're getting and that you're able to work with. You can deal with privacy issues by data aggregation. So my vision is citizens providing not just the sensor data, but also observations. It's smoggy. As a tweet that is location-based, it goes into the system. I'm having a hard time breathing. There's some asthma stuff going on. It's going into the system. You couple that with maybe a flow of data from the ER department telling you not who's there, but that 15 people have checked in with asthma. And you start to be able to build a really great understanding of what's going on in the real-time environment just around air quality. You start talking about water quality, soil quality, and I don't know. I think that's what the next wave is going to be, and it's a lot more than what one single government or one regulator can do.
Bruce, did you want to comment? Did you want to add a comment?
Sure. I echo those comments, and you know, I think in terms of citizen science, you know, the true test of the technologies that have been developed is using them. And if users, citizens, start using these technologies to help inform people about the world that they live in, and case in point is development of apps, and just the explosion of apps, and those apps primarily are being driven by people who care about something, and it's often local, something that's geographic and local, and that's something that they care about. Maybe it's a pothole in their, you know, on the road that they're trying to draw attention to. Maybe it's air quality. But the more that we can connect the citizens to data, they'll start to appreciate just how important and powerful that can be in helping inform people about what can be done and what maybe should be done and where those priorities are or should be.
Chris, it looks like you want to jump in.
Yeah, and what I would say is our catalog's open. If anybody wants to put data there, please. And there's a lot of jurisdictions around the world that do that. And I think the challenge is, in all the things that we're saying, and Matt's talking about QA, this is a whole new world. Nobody has created the rules yet, let alone the metadata dictionary. And it takes courage for people to be in that space and to trust each other. But the way we've been doing things is no longer sustainable, and we've got to figure out a new way. And if you have any data, you know, about Edmonton, or that would make sense with the mashup, send it our way. Well, we host data for the school boards right now because they don't have their own data catalog. So.
And Tracey.
So, I mean, the conversation's been going on for a long time. Volunteer geographic information is one, user-driven information is another, citizen science is another. And I think they're all really great things. But at the end of the day, there needs to be some kind of scientific model behind these. So it can't just be randomness, particularly when we're talking about health issues, because if you start reporting, you know, that X number of people are going into a hospital with X number of diseases, there's going to be a panic. So one needs to be cautious, and there needs to be some public policy and some planning around these things. I think that these initiatives are much more interesting when you have groups that are already involved in those issues actually going that next step. So they already know the air quality science, they already know public health issues, and they learn how to use the web with their members and the people that they collaborate with to be able to create these kinds of programs. I don't think it's going to, I think just random citizenry doing this, we're just going to get an awful lot of noise. Not in all cases, okay, because I've seen examples where, you know, we have Flu Watch on Google and stuff, which is really kind of interesting. But I think that there needs to be something where the associations that are and the community groups that are already involved in these issues need to get more involved and learn how to mobilize and to be able to use the social web and the sensor web in a very, very interesting and new way. The other thing, what you're talking about with downsizing that I find very interesting, and it's one of my concerns, and I'm hoping that open data advocates can talk about it a little bit more, is I don't want government out of the business of information. I want government to produce information. I don't want government to suddenly go, well, we're putting the data out there, we don't have to make reports anymore. No, I want my government to be knowledgeable about the data that they're putting out, and I want governments to be able to write intelligent reports and to have a position statement or a vision document that's evidence-based. I don't want them out of that business. And I think that's an issue that we're going to have that conversation, because I'm already hearing whispers and murmurs. Nobody's overtly saying that they're going to do that, but I'm seeing people going, well, why do we have to do this? We can just put all the data out and we don't have to make reports anymore. That's an issue of downsizing that I have an issue with. And then one final great example was done in San Francisco, where a citizen scientist used a public data set, a transit data set, and they looked at where transit doesn't go, who can't afford transit. You know, so it's one thing to have, you know, a nice app that tells you in 2 seconds when the bus is coming, but what if you can't afford to get on the bus? Mm-hmm. Who can't afford to get on the bus? Where does the bus not go? Which city services aren't serviced properly by the bus or the train or whatever it is? And how can we improve that using transit data? And so what we haven't seen yet is we haven't seen open data people, or we haven't seen citizens at large take a data set and do that kind of analysis yet. And that's what I'm excited about, and that's the public policy perspective that I'm really excited to see, and I'm looking forward to seeing that.
Did any of the panel members want to provide a follow-up, or should we move on to the next question?
All I would say is, Tracey, work on that policy stuff, because we're going to keep releasing data.
The gentleman on the front row, I think, is the next.
Yeah, so I don't know if this is working, but I've got a question about how you pull together data from multiple different sources. I mean, one of the problems we face in Australia and Victoria is that if it's just the City of Melbourne, that's probably okay, but a lot of the data is held by utilities, by power companies, by transport companies. There's often a network of those. There's resistance within those to releasing their data, and there's often resistance within government departments too. I mean, it takes a long time to change that culture around. And it's also, the second question, is it a chicken or an egg problem? Is it the applications that we need that will drive release of the data, or if you release the data, will you drive the applications? So that's another question.
Just before they answer, did everybody in the back row hear the question? We weren't mic'd on that, but everybody heard the question okay? Then, Tracey, did we want to start with you this time?
I don't think it's a technology question. I don't think it's a technology issue. There's a ton of it's a standards issue, that's one, an interoperability issue, yes, and you can shift technologies to that, but it's really a cultural issue. You have got to go shake down data out of people's drawers, pockets, hard drives. You have got to be incredibly persuasive. I mean, you have no idea how persuasive I am on the phone to try and get data out of people. But it takes me an awful lot of time. I can spend an entire day on one small data set. What a huge waste of my time when I could be spending that day working with that data set and creating an information product upon which we can make an interesting decision. So the issue that you bring up is a classic, I'm in the geomatics field, and in GIS we've been dealing with that issue forever, actually, because that's what geographers do. We work with people from other disciplines and other sciences to try and overcome these problems. And the issue is generally, if you have a common issue around which you wish to coalesce, suddenly the data becomes liberated. So 3 nations, 1 lake has to be managed. Suddenly standards get developed, interoperability gets developed. You develop the software, the GIS, etc. And I mean, if you look at initiatives like Global Map, if you look at initiatives like global spatial data infrastructures, that's what they're all about. And that's where the intel on that collaboration is. And in Canada, I mean, just to develop the street network of Canada was a memorandum of understanding between provinces and territories where they were going to pool and share their resources, but NRCan was going to host it. So that collaboration exists, but what we don't have is, we don't have utilities yet, and we don't have the multiple branches of government yet, and I think the work that Ashley is doing in Edmonton on open government, that's what that's about. It's creating and transforming a kind of institutional culture that says open first, close second, and then doing it based on good standards, interoperability, et cetera, et cetera.
Matthew, it looks like you've got something you want to contribute.
I think Tracey said all the interesting things that I was going to say, so thank you. One of the things, just to add to what Tracey said, is I think if we want to automate some of these processes of multiple data streams and making sense of it, we need a reasonable sense-making protocol or a sense-making system that can take these multiple data streams, call out the interesting or the important pieces, and combine it with the other interesting, important pieces to give us something that we don't already have in all the separate data streams. And from a research perspective, I find that very exciting. There's no automated system for doing that, so it's some sort of computer-human interface, like I know Ushahidi, did I pronounce that right?
Yes, you did.
Ushahidi. They have a Swift River application that is used in countries in crisis like Haiti that will take many, many different types of data and figure out what's important and what needs to be combined together and flag it for a human to look at. And Tracey just pointed out to me that it's called semantic ontologies, or the semantic web.
And I'll tweet the link to it. And so just to answer the question on chicken and egg, I think it goes hand in hand. That's why in 2010, just after we released our open data catalog, we ran an apps competition to generate interest. We got 34 apps for $50,000. I think that's a good deal. Ottawa got 101 apps for $50,000. That's a better deal. And on the front of, everybody needs to play in the open ecosystem, but somebody needs to start. And so in Edmonton, we just decided we would start, and for the last 2 years we've been inviting people to join us. Sometimes it's a lonely party, sometimes there's hope, and there's hope coming at different levels. We're seeing it. But it's not just about government. There's a huge number of private industries, private companies, private sector who are in this space. And from my keeping track of things, I think Nike is one of the leaders there. So there's an open data movement in government, yes, and in private industry. And when that comes together in an open ecosystem, then different things happen. And if we don't get to that soon, we may experience the Arab Spring, and the people in Egypt, clearly use the technology, maybe not open data, but social media. And in the past, we've rioted in Canada when we don't win the Stanley Cup. But people will only wait for so long for change to happen. Back to Matthew for a moment.
So just to follow up on what Chris was saying, I think that you often get unintended consequences that are good, that you can't see when you host these app competitions. So for instance, one of the apps, Alertsy, you put in your postal code and it tells you when you have to take out the garbage the night before. And the happy circumstance for me is that it saved my marriage, because I can now take out the garbage.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Bruce, a final comment on this question.
Yeah, I think, along with chickens come eggs, and they're both an integral part of the system. I think one of the things, for example, I'll use the example I'm most familiar with, and that is the Water and Environment Hub. We put a lot of effort into getting and accessing existing data sets. Some of them reside in government locations and just pointing to them, but also developing an API so that developers can then take that information, download it, and develop their own applications. So there's a whole series of things that are enabling, from, in my view, citizens actively engaging and becoming more knowledgeable about how these tools can help them. And then also, it's incumbent, I think, on us as professionals in these areas to really identify what the barriers are. And we've heard the word culture today several times. It really disturbs me that in this day and age that we still have a situation where it seems the opposition parties generally politically are quite enthusiastic about data, but for some reason the government in power maybe is less so. It's probably quite obvious as to the reasons why, but I think the opportunity for transparency and openness default more to a culture of openness as to a culture of secrecy. And that's really the difference. And you have a choice to make, and I think the point that was made around the Arab Spring is the more of a culture of openness we have, I think the better society we have.
Were there any further comments from the panel? Otherwise, we'll go to the next question. Gentleman on the second row.
Kind of along the lines of the last question, I've noticed with the concept of blogging, it's generally hard for people to get into in that they don't want to release an imperfect product. How much of that do you think plays into some of these institutions not maybe resisting releasing the information because they just don't want to do it, or because they just can't see the use of it or think it's incomplete?
Bruce, did you want to lead off this time?
No, I was just putting the motion for you. Go.
Bruce, go ahead.
Well, I think it varies. And to be fair to the folks in government, and believe me, I worked with a lot of them, a lot of them would love to be able to share it, but because of legislation, because of regulations, because of policy, they just can't. And in some cases, I think it's in the best interests of society that some data just not get shared and not be open. So there are decisions that have to be made, and good policy has to be written, and it has to be thoughtful and balanced. That would be my general response.
That's what I was going to say. But and the other thing I would add to it is that through that, the organizations, the political body, the administrative leadership, give permission, because a lot of people in government are just looking for permission because they don't want to not look good, right? And so it's just when you know you have that permission and you're not going to get the whack-a-mole if something bad goes wrong, because bad stuff always happens by mistake. So it's that the policy framework is really important, and then people need to be told, okay, it's okay to do that now. We'll release the data. And for us, I think for some of our early adopters, it was almost like, are you sure nothing bad is going to happen to us? And so it's almost 2 years now, and nothing bad has happened, and nobody's taken the data and used it against us, because we always have the source, because we can always pull out the source data. And so I think it's just that people having that sense that, oh, it's okay now. Nothing bad is happening in open data world.
Tracey, did you want to add something?
I mean, data quality is pretty important, right? As someone who's a social scientist, I don't want to work with crappy data. I don't want to work with inaccurate data. I don't mind having qualifiers on the data that'll tell me its reliability, its accuracy, its provenance, et cetera. I want to know those things. So I don't think it's necessarily the risk averse of the perfectedness of the data set that is precluding people from sharing. I think it's fear. I mean, I'm doing an analysis right now of the Atlas of Canada over time, and I discovered in the 5th edition of the Atlas of Canada, a number of maps weren't published, and some of those maps were not published simply because they made a minister look bad. Well, that's not a good enough reason to not share a map, you know, particularly when it was on a public health issue. So I agree with both of you on that issue that not all data should be shared, absolutely, and that there needs to be some data aggregation in terms to maintain privacy and so on. But as a citizen, I want to know what those criteria are. And I want to know very clearly that those criteria were used in making the decisions of what is and what is not accessible. And at the moment, the criteria, well, there aren't any criteria. And I think that this is the part that's going to have to become really important. And that's where a strategy becomes important, and that's where a policy becomes important, and that's where a decision tree becomes important within an institution to be able to overtly make those decisions, so that if I make a call and I'm told no, it's not because I don't feel like it today, or because I'm afraid my boss is going to be mad at me, or because I'm risk averse. There's actually been a decision, and an informed decision has been made, and they can report back to me what that decision is.
Bruce?
Just a quick example of where it can go wrong. Recently I was at a talk on the right, it was a talk on the right to know during Right to Know Week, which was last week, I believe. And Lauren Motley, who's the editor-in-chief at the Calgary Herald, talked about a story which I think is relevant to the conversation. It was very briefly, they wanted to get access to health records for restaurants in Calgary. And once they received that information from the city, they published it. And unfortunately, there was a mistake in the data. And one of the restaurants that, in fact, had not been on the red list was inadvertently placed on that list. And, of course, the Calgary Herald is being sued. Now, does that mean that that the city should turn that access and flow of data off because of one mistake? The city decided no. They had the courage to continue to let the data flow and to continue to make it available. So I guess the story and the lesson is, because people are nervous about how that data can be used, does not mean or justify, I think, preventing it from being out in the public domain. What came out of it is the systems internally were reviewed, the mistake was corrected, and double checks were put in place so that now we have a higher quality of data set.
Just a final comment from Matthew before we carry on.
I think one of the things that folks don't consider in terms of this conversation is the community building that has to happen and the trust that needs to be established between a government and a citizenry, that mistakes will be made. And they don't have to be, if they're minor mistakes, they don't have to be headline news. It's just a minor mistake. You fix it, you carry on. David Yves talks about the city as a beta, where there's always improvement happening, and because something went wrong or didn't work as planned doesn't mean that it has to be a bigger conversation. It just means that little glitch has to get fixed. And I think that trust is the underlying theme with this, and that there's a lack of trust of citizens in their governments, and I think the same flows back, that governments aren't going to trust that citizens will understand what the data means.
Just one follow-up question, follow-up comment, Bruce?
And we've had a focus on government. I think the same flows for industry. We've heard a lot about the Trans-Canada Pipeline, Keystone Pipeline, and also the oil sands review, and the need for more open data and openness there. So I think the industry is realizing that it's in their best interest to get more information out there as well. So I just wanted to add that because we hadn't.
Further questions from the audience? There's one up front again. Robin?
So, a fascinating discussion. Thanks to all of you. One of the themes that seems to be coming through is that policies change rather more slowly than technology does. That's especially true at the federal government level, perhaps less so at the provincial, well, actually maybe even more so at the provincial level. We are in Alberta. But the municipalities seem to be leading the way. I'm very impressed with what Chris is telling us about what's happening in Edmonton. A couple of weeks ago, I was at the Big Data Forum and listening to the CIO from the City of New York talking about all the apps they're putting forward. What do you see as a way for policy to be made more nimble so that it can keep up? Or are we just in a situation of anarchy where the thought leaders make it happen and then the legal folks come along afterwards, as we heard from Michael Geist this morning, and try and put some rules around it?
Chris?
I'll take a run at that. So we're very fortunate in Edmonton because our legal people are very interested in spending time themselves understanding, and that's around OpenGov and cloud and that. Part of that is that we're driving pretty hard on that. But Frank Work, who's currently the Information Privacy Commissioner in the province, talks a lot about this gap that's emerging. And I think what's going to happen, and we're not in control of the technology and the consumerization of technology. That's happening, kind of around us, and we're participating in it. I think what it's going to do is create a burning platform, and anytime you have a burning platform, then you have the drive and the ability to deal with the things that have always been in the way. I function well at the municipal level. I don't know if I would ever function at other levels where you're dealing with policy, and Tracey deals with that. On some of the things we're dealing with, I like to run like a river through rock. Slowly we will carve a path, right? But I only have so much time. So I think the policymakers are starting to understand this, and there's a session that you're doing later that I'm going to be part of in terms of kind of what's next, and I've got some things on that, kind of future things. But I really see the convergence of things like the Open Government Partnership, which was announced at the UN a couple of weeks ago. A number of countries are involved in that. Canada we just got in before the door closed, and we've got some work to do. So the Open Government Partnership, the work of the Information and Privacy Commissioners, things happening at all levels, I believe are coming together. We still have to deal with those big issues like data sovereignty before countries build up too many walls around them. But I really think the technology, the need from, and the desire from individuals to have access to the information so that they can save their marriage is going to create that burning platform, and the policy folks are going to say, finally, we need to do something, and we've been waiting all this time to do it. Now let's get on with it. But it's that I think is going to happen on an international level, and I don't think it's jurisdictional, except we all need to work together on it.
Tracey?
So we're at a really interesting point because policymakers haven't caught up. And it's very hard to find those people who can do those two things, who can understand the technology, who can understand the law, who can understand an IT system, like the way Chris understands an IT system in a city, but who can also be social, understand citizens' issues, democratic deliberations, and develop public policy. I mean, in the world that I'm in the community-based organizations, they're just not there. Right? So the census issue was the first time where this group in the Community Data Consortium that I mentioned earlier actually understood that, actually data are political. There's a political issue. There's a democratic issue in relation to access to public data. Well, what is that? So now they're going through a process after having done this census thing to try and learn what it means to do that. But there are really no community-based organizations in Canada. There is no nonprofit organization in Canada at a national scale that has taken this on. There's no one university institution in Canada that has taken this on as an issue. So we're in a really interesting place where I think there's a lot of opportunities for these entities to be created. We don't have an Open Knowledge Foundation. You know, the Open Knowledge Foundation did approach us, the Civic Access folks, and said, do we create a new list? We said, no, the Civic Access list is good, but what we need is we need some money for people to get together and to be able to have a conversation so that we can start developing some kind of coalition or some kinds of process to put pressure on the development of these types of policies. But citizens, I mean, you know, our newspapers are notoriously horrid at speaking about data issues and technology issues, right? My Globe and Mail thing sends me the same cheesy science thing 3 days in a row. That's what I get on Science in Canada. We really have a lot of work to do to get the public up to speed on these issues. I mean, I would love on social policy issues to have the same kind of energy we have on copyright. But the people who are involved in social policy issues don't have access to the technology in the same way, and they don't have access to the same resources, and it's not a cadre of the nation's engineers involved in the issue. So the other thing is these things happen in IT departments. They happen in that area. And IT departments are brilliant at getting things done, but then you have to convince the rest of the gang. It's a different culture. And we need to re-educate that culture. So I'm hoping that we're going to start seeing, you know, digital policy schools starting to emerge, and people being able to be more facile with the issues related to the politics around data and around technology and around social media, so that we can have much better conversations. But we're not there yet, and we can't expect our public servants to be there because they're just not there yet. They're in shock at the moment, I think is the best way to describe it.
And back to Bruce for a final comment on this question.
Yeah, maybe I'll take a slightly different tact on this. You know, government institutions that we currently operate under were developed under a much simpler time. And they tended to operate in silos. They tended to operate very much on more of a power base, a fiefdom basis. And governments now are they're in a really difficult situation. I don't in any way envy them. They have existing institutions and legislation and policy that is outdated, and they're trying to catch up. The problem is, and I don't have an answer or a solution specifically because of the nature of the problem, and that is the technology and the tools that are evolving much faster than government could ever catch up with. So it would be my hypothesis that we're going to have a complete re-engineering of how government works. Okay.
We're running sorry, Bruce, go ahead.
And that's the only way for us to really survive this next wave.
We're running quite short on time, but there is one last question from the gentleman in the back row. I'd like to take that, and then we'll wrap.
Okay, it's more a comment in response to the last two comments from Tracey and Bruce. I think there is an emerging forum in Canada which has the potential to address the issues that you've just articulated, which I think are the critical issues. Fundamentally, we're faced with the challenge of kind of developing a new narrative for Canada and what we're going to be as a nation going forward. And the initiative I speak of is called iCanada. And it was initiated by the Canadian Advanced Technology Alliance, but it is reaching out very aggressively to the municipal sector. And Chris, you're involved. Robin, I think you're on the Board of Governors, is that right? So there's several people in this room, including myself, who would be happy to engage around that opportunity. Anybody in the room who's interested to become involved in that initiative, the invitation is open.
Excellent, thank you. Did any of the panel members want to comment very, very briefly on that statement?
If you're not an Apple person, does that mean you can still participate? No, I'm just kidding.
The stock's doing pretty well today, keeping track of that. And to your point on the narrative, and I think part of cultural change is really important, like we're doing today, is telling the story. And one of the reasons why I left PowerPoint a couple of years ago was it forced me into this linear thing, and I was doing a Prezi the other day at the Information Commissioners Conference, and I think they went on tilt. because it's just a different tool. But we have a rich culture and history in the first people of this country in storytelling, and I think we need to get back to that in so many ways. And so some of the things we're doing at the city and moving things to a new collaborative platform, we're in the process of moving to Google for mail and docs and calendar and whatever else. We need to help people see themselves in the narrative. I think that's what you're talking about. And that really, then when people can see themselves in the narrative, then they go, oh, well, maybe that's possible. You know, we haven't done it that way for 106 years, but maybe something could change. Yeah. And so just telling the story is extremely important. And thank you all for your, not that we're finished, but thanks for your participation and question and being part of the story.
Oh, we will be.
One of the work that I explore is called geographic imagination. So what helps us understand and construct a picture of it in our head of what Canada is. And I use always the example of data and maps as what it is that has constructed part of that imagination. And what if citizens got to participate more in the co-construction of our geographic imagination, and what different stories would we tell about the country? So narration, I think, is very, very important. And you guys were awesome. You guys had great questions, super great questions, so thank you.
If I can just take a brief moment, I promised that the group would be finished at 1:45, and we'll do that. I'm astounded. I've been working in open data since for the last 4 years, and I thought I was working alone, that there's nobody else cared, right? Obviously, many people care, and it's just delightful to see this kind of conversation and this kind of engagement between, quite frankly, intelligent, informed people, and it's just been a delight to listen to. I think the panel has been absolutely outstanding. I think the questions from the audience have been absolutely outstanding, and I think we should give ourselves a round of applause for having conducted what I think is a really elevated debate about this very important subject. So.